you can lose yourself in Borges, and certainly Borges is somebody you keep coming back to again and again, because at different stages of your life and different stages of your reading experience, you will find that Borges has something to say. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to ask the question, what does it mean to be influential in literature? In fact, what does it mean to be influential in writing across genres? Today, we want to present the case of probably the most influential writer of the second half of the 20th century, Jorge Luis Borges. Now, Borges was an Argentinian writer. He was born at the end of the 19th century in Buenos Aires, and that's where he grew up. And he had a pretty remarkable, in a way, childhood. He was from a well-to-do family. And he grew up through ancestry, through nannies, his grandmother very much. He grew up with multiple languages. Spanish, obviously, English, very quickly, French. And that meant also that within a very heavily cultural environment at the time, Borges grew among books, among texts, and among the treasures offered across multiple literatures. Now, what does it mean to be influential in literature? Well, that is the case of Borges. Basically, it means that throughout literature since 1960s, 70s, you find traces of Borges' approach, Borges' thoughts and concepts pretty much everywhere. I made a very partial list. Alan Lightman is certainly one. Calvino, Italo Calvino, of course, Pynchon, Gene Wolfe in literature, Cortázar, and of course many other South American writers. Ted Chiang, also a science fiction writer. K. Dick, another one. Paul Auster, in his first novel, probably. There's quite a bit of Borges there, I think. New York Trilogy as well. I would say is heavily under not the influence necessarily, but it is clearly somebody who has read Borges. Saramago, of course, Eco, Umberto Eco, Pynchon, Laurent Binet in France, Bernard Quirini, the wonderful Belgian writer. And the list could go on for hours, probably. Really, at some stage, you've got to say that anybody who was interested in literature, or who is interested in literature, has come across Borges and has been influenced by him to a certain degree. Now, what does it mean very quickly? Well, it quite simply, for us at least today, it will simply mean, because we could spend a long time on this, but for us really, it's this sort of meta approach to literature. So Borges was a book lover, a literature lover. He was a poet. He wrote fiction and non-fiction, but only short fiction. Never wrote a novel, for example. And essays, many essays, non-fiction. And basically his approach to literature was twofold. On one hand, an extreme love for words and literature as an object, as a historical, cultural object as well. On the other hand, literature as a tool. Literature that you use to basically think about things, to sort of conceptualize things, to reflect on ideas, to reflect on thoughts, on concepts, on notions, through the prism of either a real fictional narrative or a semi-fictional narrative where strong elements of non-fiction come back, as it were, or form the backbone of the story. And for that reason, the non-fiction of Borges is immense and immensely influential again, because of all the themes he addresses repeatedly throughout his work. Now, before we come to that, a very quick presentation, overview of Borges and his themes, and those we will say a few words about in a few minutes, a few seconds. Very simple questions in many ways, and of course, as very often is the case, very difficult question. Well, what is it to be, or what is one's identity? Something that he comes back again and again through, for example, the idea of the double, of the mirrors. What is literature, of course? What is fiction? What is non-fiction? But what is literature in itself? Not in terms of academic approach and highly theoretical ideas, but a very simple question. What is that body of text that we term literature, and what is the relationship between its parts? What is knowledge? What is to know? What is to create? What is to do? What is it to be an author? Something, of course, that he will address many times. And indeed, what is identity? What is it to have an identity? What is having an identity? What does it even mean? So very briefly, Borges, born in 1899 and died in 86. And he has written quite a few works, really, but again, no novels, so most of it is in relatively short format, short to very short. He's also written a lot of poetry. He's also famous for, I don't know who's the most famous for it. He also collaborated with a great Argentinian writer, Adolfo Bioy Casares, and his wife, Silvina Ocampo, so very, very big names in Argentinian literature, in South American world literature, really, all of them. Borges was famously appointed national keeper of the National Library, Argentinian Library. Then he was deposed or replaced, ousted. You may remember, of course, that in those decades, Argentina was not, by all account, a very free country, politically speaking. So Borges' position in all this was a little bit strange. And one has to understand that at that time, in the 50s, 60s, 40s, Borges was only known within Argentina. He wasn't really known outside of Argentina. And in fact, the first translations into other languages than Spanish, the first one came in French, right at the beginning of the 1950s by actually somebody who was a very famous French literary critic, translator and writer himself, Roger Caillois. And the first translation of a volume of short stories by Borges in English came only in 1962 or 67, something like that. So basically, that is what we have with Borges. The moment he was published in English, he was discovered, as it were, by the rest of the world, and then his fame shot up. He was invited for multiple tours in America, for example, in Europe, everywhere really. He traveled a lot, and what is perhaps also quite well known about him, of course, is that Borges became blind relatively early in his life. And you can imagine what that meant for somebody like him, a lover of books, a lover of reading, a writer, of course, to become blind. And a famous anecdote is, of course, that he then recruited people to read books to him. Notably the wonderful Alberto Manguel, a wonderful writer himself about books and reading. And so people would come and read to him from his favorite books or new books, etc. And that was Borges, a relatively innocuous-looking man who did not necessarily go for big fame and the bling-bling that comes with it. But at the same time, somebody who had an enormous influence in the literature sense. So, what are those things that make him so special, that make his work so special, and that make his work so influential? And multiple things, of course, but I will only give a few examples of some of those themes. Because you will see immediately how they are probably appearing here and there in the other works that you have read or are reading right now. So, Borges was not obsessed, that's probably a too strong a word, but was a great lover of Anglo-Saxon literature and his Icelandic sagas and that type of texts. And he loved those and he rhapsodized about them multiple times. But at the same time, Borges was also interested in detective novels. He was, again, a great lover of 19th century English literature, for example, and certainly people like Wilkie Collins at the end of 19th century. And so he was very happy to read detective novels, as well as Icelandic sagas from the 10th century, or Anglo-Saxon literature, of course, but equally poetry across the ages, French literature. He had a deep love for his own literature. In other words, what he was interested in was not so much text in isolation from one another, but literature as a body. And that's one idea that Borges comes back to many times in his work. It is literature as a continuum. Literature is not pockets of text in time. Literature is a complete continuum. And as he says somewhere, there is no beginning, nor is there an end to any text ever written, because each text ever written by whoever, wherever in the world, comes from other texts and segues, continues in other texts. The text that you wrote yesterday is basically the continuation of an older text and the beginning of newer texts in the future. Literature is a continuum. So it makes complete sense to love Wilkie Collins as much as Icelandic sagas, because these are not isolated from one another, they are part of this continuum. This is, of course, what Umberto Eco, or I think it's Jean-Claude Carrière who says that they co-wrote a book on reading and the love of books called This Is Not the End of the Book. And that's what Carrière, I think, says, that, of course, it makes sense to think that Cervantes, the great Spanish writer, influenced Kafka. I think it's Kafka. But he says, equally, one has to remember that Kafka has an influence on our reading of Cervantes. Because even though those texts were written 500 years apart, having read Kafka necessarily changes the way you read literature and subsequent books, and so your reading of Kafka will have an influence on the Cervantes text, which was again written half a millennium before. This continuum, this idea of continuum, is therefore very important in Borges, and that brings him to question the very nature of, well, books and knowledge in general, in probably one of his most famous short essays, The Library of Babel. You'll find multiple representations of that, basically infinite library, in which all the books that have ever been published, will ever be published, or could be published, are present. In other words, you have a book with only A's in it, and then only B's in it, etc. You have books that make no sense. You have books written in languages we don't know, languages that have disappeared, or languages that will exist in the future. This is not science fiction at all, of course. It's a very entertaining text, both on the amount of books, the amount of writing, the amount of knowledge that is around us, to which we will never have complete access, and, of course, the very question of, well, what is writing? Have all the text that we can think already been, in some ways, written? Can everything be written? He says somewhere, I really cannot remember where, but he says in one of his essays that if you stop to consider a little bit how many books come out every year and how many books one can read, reasonably speaking, if one only read books, that would probably account for 1% of what is published, which is itself 1% of what has been published. In other words, the immensity of knowledge, the immensity of texts mean that we can never, ever hope to know more than a fraction of what there is. And we have to think, therefore, about the whole and not simply about individual text. So what is literature? What is creation? What is an author? What it is to write? I will try to put a very short text, if it fits really, Borges and I, extremely short, on the nature of authorship and on the difference between person and writer. Margaret Atwood has a wonderful short story called The Voice, or Voice, exactly the same thing. And Borges also wrote a very famous text, Pierre Menard. And Pierre Menard is a writer who decides to rewrite the Don Quixote, the Cervantes text, novel. But what Menard does is that he writes Cervantes, or Don Quixote, he rewrites it to the word. In other words, the question now being asked is, has Menard created anything? Who is the author of a text? Because Menard doesn't copy from the original. Menard knows Cervantes, knows Don Quixote so well that he recreates it from memory. Is that creation? What is creation? And again, I have to insist that those texts are all very short, typically 1,000, 2,000 words maybe. A wonderful text, for example, The Wall and the Book, is, I think, perhaps 1,000 words. It's about the first emperor of China who decided to burn all the books and at the same time started the construction of the Great Wall of China. He decided to burn all the books that dealt with the past before him. In other words, he tried to destroy the past, erase the past, all the things that were before him, so time would start with him, but at the same time he erected a Great Wall of China. And as Borges asked, was it to keep people out or keep people in? All this in 1,000 words, it blows your mind. You have enough material to think about for about 3 months or more, and that is the beauty of Borges, of course. It reads extremely easily. One thing that he was very interested in himself, was, of course, and that perhaps resonates a little bit less with, say, people like me who live very far away from Argentina, was his very strong interest in the history of his country, really, and especially the history of the pampas, of the large open plains, and the Argentinian identity within that, of course, to the equivalent of the cowboys, basically, of the opening of the West in America. Rough men, lovers of music, lovers of horses, lovers of open space. And that is something that you find very often in his fiction as well. When it is set in Argentina, it is this idea of very wide open spaces and what that does to a person, an identity. How do you see the world? How do you in fact create, build an Argentinian identity when you are in a way so far removed from what people like Borges do every day? Of course, this idea of, because he spoke many languages and because he saw literature as a continuum, means that Borges was interested in all types of literature, in all types of languages. He is not really somebody who played with language so much as somebody who also reflected on the role of language. The ruins of Babylon, for example, or things to do with fate, destiny, knowing time and the future, so the garden forking path, all those short stories are basically, again, ways to think, devices to explore ideas. And so the value of the short story is not only in the short story itself. Its real value, perhaps, is in the ideas that it generates in us, the ways it asks us, requires us to see things that we know very well differently, to take them in a different direction, from a different perspective. All this in very short forms and just delightful type of writing. You can lose yourself in Borges, and certainly Borges is somebody you keep coming back to again and again, because at different stages of your life and different stages of your reading experience, you will find that Borges has something to say. So, in conclusion, what can we say? That what is it to be an influencer in literature? Well, it is to permeate, it is to be present, either under the surface or openly so, in thousands of books and novels and poetry and short stories written later on. It is to be present not only in one genre, literature, mainstream literature, but across genres. He's had also a profound influence on the literature of the 1980s, for example. It's very clear. It is also to be present across languages, because you find traces of Borges, of course, in Spanish and South American Spanish. You find him everywhere in French, in English, in Italian, in German, and I'm sure across many, many other languages in the world. And that is what it is to be really an influencer. Somebody who may not be known by the main public, but somebody who has profoundly influenced all those who make it their task to write for others in fictional form. And for that reason only, but it is a bad reason in itself, for that reason and for all the wonderful work that Borges has produced over the years, work that remains and will remain very important in the history of our literatures everywhere around the globe. For all those reasons, you must simply hurry and get him on your laps or on your screen and enjoy the wonderful, wonderful, absolutely incomparable writer that is Jorge Luis Borges. Don't forget, of course, if you have any preferred texts, favorite short stories or essays by Borges, drop me a comment. I'm always happy, of course, when somebody engages with this. In the meantime, bye-bye, and thank you very much.